Disability Pride Month is ending today. So if anyone has been doing anything fun for Disability Pride and celebrating disability inclusion, then it's a great opportunity to share what you've been up to, either in the webinar chat, if you're joining us now, or even if you are listening back on our YouTube channel, then do take this opportunity to share what you've been up to. It'd be great to hear what you've been doing and what you've been talking about and doing at work, in the workplace. So for those of you who are joining us now, welcome to the Let's Talk Disability event hosted by the UWI, although not all that successfully today. We've had some technical issues, but this is to celebrate Disability Pride Month. And thank you to US Tech Solutions for helping to bring this panel together and for highlighting this discussion. Today's event, we will not be taking any call-ins, but we will be accepting questions through the chat feature. So if you have any questions as we go through, or if you're listening back to this and you have some questions, please do leave them in the comments and we'll get back to you with the answers. But the agenda for today looks something like this. So we'll begin with the barriers to people with disabilities in the workplace. We'll then talk about the challenges for organisations, what's holding organisations back from progress, and then we will be looking at how organisations can move the dial on their workplace initiatives around disability. At the end, there will be a chance, hopefully, I say that now, we're at 4:20. There may be an opportunity to ask any questions you might have. So if you do have any questions as we're going through, then please pop them into the chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we will get those questions answered. But today's discussion, what are we here talking about today? Well, first, we have to recognize that disability is a spectrum, and it encompasses a wide range of physical, sensory, and cognitive impairments. And studies show that 1 in 5 people identify as having a disability. And this is a significant portion of the population, but also of the workforce, individuals who have the potential to bring unique skills and perspectives to an organization. However, despite this potential, a significant gap remains. So the unemployment rate for disabled people is often double that of non-disabled people. And this translates for organizations to a loss of talent and also potential in terms of innovation and productivity and employee loyalty for companies. But likewise is a missed opportunity for that individual to contribute and thrive. So while the business case for accessibility and inclusion is a clear one, with research showing increased innovation, productivity, and employee loyalty, we still have a journey ahead to create truly inclusive and accessible workplaces. So let's introduce your panelists and we will dive right in. Just quickly, before I do that, I had prepared this on our other platform, but nevertheless, I shall post it now. We are providing you here with just some statutes that you might like to look at in the UK and in the US around disability support and rights in your local area. If you do have more questions, then your local government will have more information on their website. To find these, I just typed in disability statutes UK and US, and this is where we've got to. But if you go to your local government website, you should find more specific information to your geography. So introducing our speakers today, we have Estella Lugo, wave Stella, who is a disability inclusion and design consultant. We also have joining us Sydney Elaine Butler, an HR and DEIA consultant. That's like a tongue twister to me, but I'm glad I got that right. Hayley Kellard, who is the founder of Dotty About Braille. And we also have joining us David Pushkin, who is from the UK public sector, joining us to talk about his experience. And we also have myself, Erica Bertels, the CEO of the UWI, and I'll be your host today and navigating us through this conversation. So, Section 1, talking about the barriers to people with disabilities. I think it's a really important topic for us to be discussing, is actually understanding the barriers to work for people with disabilities. And to kickstart this conversation, David, I'm going to start with you. So I wondered if you might share with us your experience as someone whose disability happened while in employment. You know, what barriers have you experienced through this journey?
Yeah, really, really great question to kick off. So just so what happened is basically around 2019, I became visually impaired and lost vision in both of my eyes. So that was a really, a readjustment. I suppose barriers were just around the readjustments. Obviously we talk about our reasonable adjustments or accommodations, as they're called in North America. And it wasn't a one box fits all situation. Trying to find the right technology that's going to work for me, looking to find the right, you know, setup that was going to work for me. That was kind of like it was kind of wasn't a one box fits all, kind of like, a lot of unconscious attitudes and things. It's a lot of feeling out and a lot of kind of finding your way around things. There isn't a one box fits all solution, and it's a lot of, give or take. And I suppose the main thing is just kind of advocating for your accommodations. As I said, there isn't a one box fits all, and that kind of like was really interesting trying to find our way around generally. And it was obviously a learning process for myself to kind of think what's going to work for me, as it was obviously all very new to myself. So I had just kind of had this happen to
Mm.
me in 2019.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's something that a lot of organizations don't quite anticipate, is that actually disability could happen to an employee during their time with that individual, and those adjustments will have to, take place. So thank you for sharing that. And in a moment we'll talk about kind of the barriers organizations face based on your experience. But Hayley, I just wanted to ask you, from your experience of being in the workplace, because you transitioned from working within an organization and then moved into self-employment. I wondered what barriers or challenges you were facing in the workplace kind of encouraged that shift.
Yeah, so moving to become self-employed was never my choice. It was something I basically had to do because it was either that or it didn't work. Unfortunately, in 2017, I became unwell, was later diagnosed with something called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And at first, the employer was really helpful. They were really flexible. They let me work from home. And this was before remote working is what it is today. But then after a while, they're like, you need to come back into the office. And so I tried, but just the commute and the freezing cold air conditioning and the overstimulation, I just couldn't manage that on top of the full-time hours. So I asked if I could reduce my hours. I asked if I could go back to working from home. And they basically said, no, you need to resign. So I did look for other jobs, and it was impossible to find something that fit because I can be quite unreliable, especially back then. But it was just a shame because I was working from home and that was working quite well. And I think nowadays, if that happened, they probably would have let me carry on because remote working is more acceptable. So it is a shame. I love being self-employed now, don't get me wrong. And it's like it's all worked out really well, but it wasn't my choice. And I think it's the case for a lot of disabled people that are self-employed, that we're kind of forced into it because it's either that or we don't work.
Yeah, and as you say, COVID kind of pushed a lot of these things forward. Like all of a sudden, overnight, organizations had to have a work from home, policy and way of working. And now we're kind of seeing some organizations move away from that again, which is an interesting move in itself. But it's amazing how an organization could do things like that so quickly, and yet beforehand it would have been a really long drawn out process to make that change happen. So Sydney, if we look kind of more closely around kind of the hiring and
Mhm.
recruiting process, because that's where a lot of HR minds will go to. um,
Yes.
what types of things would you say are those typical barriers, if we can say typical,
Mhm.
because we're talking about such a diverse group of needs and support
Mhm.
requirements, but um what are the typical things that you see that are, you know, preventing people with disabilities from joining the workplace?
Yeah, I feel like it's very attitude-based, the attitudinal barriers, because people's perception of what a disability is, what it looks like. For example, even like on the job description, not having an accommodation statement. And that's part of the attitudinal barriers, you know, because you think accommodation is someone getting more and getting extra. Meanwhile, it's leveling the playing field. So by not having that, you're basically saying your attitude towards people with disabilities. And then also during the interview process, you know, we realized during the pandemic that we can do remote interviews, but now some places are like, nope, you have to be on site during the interview and not willing to make those reasonable adjustments and make those accommodations. And so I really think it stems from that bias of that, you know, people think that people with disabilities can't work or they can only be in entry-level positions. So when we go for management positions or we go for higher level positions, what does that look like? Meanwhile, people with disabilities actually are more likely to get post-secondary education. And so there's all this biases and attitudes towards people with disabilities, I think is the biggest barrier to hiring and recruitment right now.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And in terms of kind of the talent that is, you know, that has the disability coming in, I suppose it's also daunting. It's having to go through that process with an organization as well.
Yeah, and I think also a lot of times we're so passionate about the work we want to do with this organization, or you know, it's like I have this post-secondary education that's aligned to this job, but the interview skills just aren't there. And it could look different, and the communication skill and styles are different. And so again, what is your perception of how to best communicate and what that looks like?
Great stuff, great stuff. And Estella, from your experience, what are the areas of kind of employment and the workplace make people with disabilities feel excluded?
So there's so much to unpack here. So there every area, really. And I don't mean to overwhelm people, but disability is not something that just affects one part of your work life or your daily life. Really, even if it's a invisible or non-apparent disability, it can still affect everything about your day. So starting from your physical accessibility into the building, around the building, meeting rooms, the placement of office supplies, printers, you know, all of those common areas as well. Whether or not your desk is accessible, whether you have the option to even stand up during the day. Someone like myself who lives with Charcot-Marie-Tooth, CMT, I can't sit for long periods of time. I have to get up, walk around. Sometimes I'm standing for calls. Sometimes I like to shut my camera off so I can walk a little bit or stretch during a call. So I think that's an important point to make too, is that we're doing all of these meetings via Zoom or other platforms, but allowing people the option sometimes to not have their camera on gives them that flexibility to move their bodies around in a healthy way. And that's just not just for disability, that's for anyone. It's not healthy to be sitting all day. We know this. And so it's important to give people that accessibility, digital accessibility, of course, making sure that software, communication tools, websites, captions, documents are accessible to employees in a way that when communications are shared within an organization, that is accessible to everyone. Somebody uses a reader or anything like that. Also, this is something that I think a lot of companies forget or overlook, is the social events that happen in work culture, whether that's team building, holiday parties, things like that. Are these spaces accessible? Are the activities accessible? A lot of these team building exercises or activities are physical, you know, hiking, whitewater rafting, like, and as beneficial that can be to the culture, it can also be very excluding to someone like myself living with a physical disability and beyond that. So I think those are some, you know, things to touch upon. Of course, Haley spoke about flexible work arrangements. You know, our work should really adapt to life and not our life around work. It should be the other way around. And having an employer that understands the importance of their employees putting their health first, and an employee that values health over profits is very rare, but I'm lucky enough to work for an organization that does that. So I can tell you from personal experience how truly beneficial that has been for me.
Amazing stuff. And actually everything you said there really kind of points to the fact that organizations also, you know, there's this employer brand piece as well. Like if they want more diverse talent in their organization, they've also got to appeal to that audience. And so if we're talking about people with disabilities, we're saying, okay, so how are you evidencing what it's like working for your company for someone who has a disability, in a way that makes them feel comfortable, that would, you know, they can imagine themselves being valued and therefore wanting to apply for that job in the first place. Because, you know, as you said, there are organizations who are already doing some great work and already have great cultures and support, but if it's for your organization who doesn't, and then that organization that does, it's, well, actually maybe that person just doesn't want to work for your organization.
Yeah, they're missing out on talent, on really high talent individuals, because those individuals have a choice of whether to go with a more inclusive employer. And so it's a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely. So let's talk about what's holding employers back then, because, you know, we can talk about what organizations should be doing, which we'll talk about at the end, but what is it that's currently holding them back? Estella, I'm going to come back to you because I guess from your experience, I wondered what some organizational kind of attitudes or practices there are that might hinder progress for disability inclusion. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think it starts with leadership. I think it's not just an HR problem, and it's not something that can just be siloed to disability and not included in the whole discussion around diversity and inclusion within the organization. So I think leadership really has to have a strong commitment, and it therefore can trickle down from there. I see this a lot in the work that I do with my partner and I with our workshops, is that just the hesitation around having open discussions about disability. It's this fear of even saying the word disabled within the organization, and having all of these, like Haley and Sydney spoke about, like all of these stigmas around disability, and not being open-minded enough to at least invite people in, like yourself, like all of us here, who can really help break down some of those stigmas and make people more comfortable speaking about disability, really understanding, helping them understand that there's people within their organizations already now with living with disabilities, how they can benefit, how this is a good business model. So I think stepping away from that siloed approach, failure to really engage employees with disabilities in these important discussions, bringing them to the table to make decisions and help develop policies. And again, like really putting processes in action, like accommodation processes. I'm not waiting for someone to need it, but actually building the infrastructure to invite people in, whether it's recruitment, whether it's providing a safe space for people to self-identify, and being open to feedback from employees and their users on how they can improve disability inclusion within the organization.
Some really interesting points there, Estella, and thank you for that. And Sydney, when it comes to policy and procedures in HR, you know, what impact does that then have on disability inclusion? Is that something that a lot of organizations are not doing so great with?
Yeah, so some, for example, organizations are now looking at having, diversity, equity, inclusion policies, but they still don't include disability in this, or they don't have. They're supposed to have an accessibility policy. So what does that look like in the workplace? Having an accommodation policy. So how, when accommodation requests do come up, what does that look like? And like you mentioned at the beginning, that the statutes of the legislation, a lot of companies just have that as the bare minimum of their policies, and just basically copy and paste directly from the legislation and the statutes and put it into a policy just to seem like they're compliant and do the bare minimum. But to go, okay, what's the actual day-to-day of your procedure when someone ask for accommodation, what does it look like? How do you make sure that there's no bias if someone asks for accommodation? Because I think a lot of times people don't understand that policies and procedures or guidelines and used to actually implement and make that change in the organization. And sometimes it's like, oh, but there's no big issue there because we have all the policies and they think they're just being compliant. And again, that's the bare minimum. And it's really, okay, what are the best practices that you're actually implementing in your organization to really foster disability inclusion? And I think also there's, because disability, like you said, is a spectrum and can include from neurodiversity to being visually impaired or having hearing impairments. It also includes mental health and addiction, and what does that look like in the workplace? And really, for example, also looking at medication and drug use in the organization. But okay, does this person have an addiction? Is it a mental health struggle? What does this look like? And really breaking down those barriers and making sure that your policies don't unintentionally bias someone that has a disability.
Yeah, and I think it's what I'm getting out of that is really the kind of look beyond kind of the absolute bare minimum of what you can get away with, and actually if disability inclusion is the goal, then you kind of have to go a step beyond that and really consider, as you say, the day-to-day impact of that.
Yeah, because I for one of my clients, I was auditing the diversity inclusion policies, and it's like and they had again the bare minimum of having the legislation piece around accessibility in the workplace. I'm like, where's your accommodation policy? And they're like, oh, we don't have one, and so that causes issues.
Yeah, and Hayley, what do you think is holding organizations back from kind of accessibility and disability inclusion?
Sometimes it's making assumptions, possibly assumptions about capability, but then there's also a big piece around cost. A lot of I say a lot, I'm stereotyping there, but employers sometimes think that if a disabled person comes for an interview, that adaptations are going to cost a lot of money. And it's sometimes really not the case. Like, I found out that I nearly didn't get a job years ago because the person interviewing me just assumed, based on the fact that I was visually impaired, that it was going to cost them money. And I don't need any adaptations at that time. So luckily I did get the job, but it's like, don't make assumptions. And also in terms of cost, because obviously there are people who will need adaptations that will cost money. There are programs like Access to Work in the UK, and I don't know if there's things outside the UK that do that too, but Access to Work will fund some or most of the cost involved with hiring a disabled person. And that applies also if you become disabled while you work there, obviously, and need those changes partway through.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the immediate thought is cost, when actually it's, if you have an agenda around disability inclusion, then, or well, I suppose not everyone will have an agenda around disability inclusion, but if you want to be as fair as possible in the hiring process, that shouldn't be a consideration, really. So David, when we spoke about your experience, we were reflecting on kind of, are organizations prepared to support people with disabilities? What are your thoughts around that, on the kind of the preparedness of organizations? Do you think they're prepared?
What I would say is, I think there isn't a one box fits all solution. As Hayley talked about, obviously, all in the UK we've got access to work, which we've looked at, but it's more about the curiosity and it's asking the questions. As we've spoken about, the broad theme here is there's a broad spectrum of disability, and there isn't a one box fits all. And I think with organizations, it's about knowing how to ask the right questions. There isn't a manual that just says this is how you deal with disability inclusion. Unfortunately, a lot of it is having that conversation, and the theme that's come through here is it is about that conversation, not having an assumption, being in dialogue. I think as a whole, yes, you could, people, organizations are told, go to Access to Work, think about doing this, is how you can do it, but it's more about how you embed that culture. And it's very simple things that, or not simple things, it's things that you just don't think about at the time. So for example, somebody who's visually impaired, or somebody who's hearing impaired, for example, you may think to yourself, well, they're in a meeting. we need to make this person aware. Oh, that if you click here, you can get captions, or and things, just little things like subtitles and little things like that just make people feel included. That's what this is generally about. It's about making sure people are included and they can do their job to the best of their ability. So I think it's more about, in short, it's about the conversation, having a conversation between those who are looking for the accommodations, reasonable adjustments, and your organization. But it's, like I said, it's curiosity, having a curious questioning mindset between all of the parties. That's how you'll achieve your inclusion.
Great stuff. Thank you, David. And we've had a comment from Vicky Hughes, who says, unfortunately, access to work is not as good as it used to be. As an employee has recently tried to use them for support, and they've said that there's a 6-month waiting list when the last time that they were used, they helped almost immediately. So we're also seeing that there are strains on the government support, as well as that prevent assistance and support being provided to individuals. So maybe it is on the organization to take more of a lead in terms of how they support their own employees.
What I would just add to that very quickly, it's a very good point. Thank you, Vicky. There are lots of moving parts. You've got, and that's the thing. It's a lot of paperwork. I wouldn't say bureaucracy and red tape, but I'd say there's a lot of, setting up and organizing, and like you said, access to work. You've got to apply to access to work. You've got to go through that whole process. Internally, in internal organization processes, you've got to go and procure things. There's in it, it's paperwork and all these things, and it can be a lot to kind of spin all those plates at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, David. And I think the preparedness of an organization is definitely coming out as and as you say, the culture of an organization is coming out as a really impactful piece to a person with disabilities experience. Let's move on to kind of moving the dial. How can organizations who have disability programs or want to start disability programs, how can they move the dial on these initiatives in their workplace? And David, I'm going to come back to you. I want to talk about line managers, because I think, in the whole process of this, a line manager is the person who is in direct contact with the individual who is seeking that support. Do you think, David, that investing in line management education and training is an essential piece to this?
Yes. Next question. I'm joking. No, yes, wholeheartedly. I think as a whole, like I said, as we've talked about, there's a broad stream, there's a broad spectrum, and I think, like I said, it's about engage in immersive culture. Like you said, you have your leaders who are kind of steering the ship on inclusion. But obviously, it needs to be across the board. So yes, I my personal view is that I think, as a whole, across organizations, I really feel that disability, awareness, or whatever you want to call it, and things around neurodiversity, I think it should be a standard rollout, because I think you look at our workforce currently, and there are more people with disability, neurodiversity. Our workforce is changing, and we need to be more adaptable and inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, while there is training out there, like disability awareness things, it's almost like it's when you have somebody who is neurodiverse or who is disabled in the general sense, that's when you go and roll out the training. I personally think that you should roll out that training as a whole, and just kind of, it's my last point I would say on it is it creates that culture of empathy. If you have an understanding of these things prior to it happening, it creates a culture of empathy. While you can have the training, as like I said, when somebody comes in with a disability, or who is not neurotypical, obviously then you kind of go and get your education. But I think what's really important is just to foster that culture, before you have somebody come in, just to be aware of it.
Yes, no, absolutely. And Estella, I wondered, what are some practical things businesses can kind of implement? What kind of strategies businesses can implement to create a more physically and virtually accessible work environment?
Yeah, so I think in addition to the human factor of like the company's why, right? It's always good to start with the why. Obviously, this is good for the employees, for the culture, but sometimes you need that extra push from the business side of it, and just shifting the conversation on not only is this good for humans and inclusion, but it's great for business. So I like to start with that as well, is having that extra buy-in from all of the different areas of a business. So disability, the Disability Equality Index in the US reported in 2018 across 346 companies in the US that disability inclusion creates 1.6 times more revenue, 2.6 times more net income, and twice as much more economic profit. So I think starting from there, on top, in addition to all of the other reasons why a company should do this, it's a no-brainer, right? And then from there, starting to open up the conversations about how to talk about disability. And that's one of the things that we do with our workshop, is just a 101, where to start, try not to overwhelm the company. How do we have this conversation with everyone involved from all different aspects of the company, all different types of employees? And then from there, we can start to audit, right? What does the physical accessibility look like of our offices and our spaces? Maybe it's our retail stores, all of that. What do the workstations look like? How can those be more accessible, inclusive? Signage and wayfinding, simple things that can be changed, whether that's fonts on your website or signage throughout your space, common rooms, restrooms, meeting rooms. And then you can go into the virtual accessibility too. What are the accessible digital tools? Captioning, are is the website user friendly? Are there remote work options? Is there continued training and awareness? It's not just the October event. It's not just a July event. It's not just a one-time speaker coming in once a year. This is part of the culture. And then integrating all of these organizational practices, getting human services, resources on board with inclusive hiring practices. And there's so many great resources out there. One in the US is called Inclusively. They really help bridge that gap. It can be very overwhelming and intimidating for a company to know where to start as far as like how to hire somebody and what accommodations and all of that involved. So I love that platform. It's great for job seekers and employers. What are the diversity and inclusion training look like? Is there an employee resource group within the organization that can help keep the momentum going, that can represent people within the organization with these disabilities and make it more personal and really grow that organic empathy and culture? So I think those are a few of the practical tools, but for me, it always starts with that conversation and opening the door to people feeling safe and to want to make real impact and change.
Absolutely, and we were at you were mentioning about ERGs, and actually we were at a DEI event earlier last week, and one of the big things to come out of the conversations was around culture, but also how ERGs are also big drivers of culture growth and what's the word? People actually kind of living the culture is when they've got those things like an employee resource group where they can tap into, connect with other people. And so ERGs seem to be, the first thing people think about and do drive inclusive cultures. So
Right. Yeah. And I like to share one quick quote that I love that really kind of encompasses the whole idea of inclusion in the workplace and anywhere else as well. Um, it's disability, I'm sorry, accessibility is getting into the building. Diversity is being invited to the table. Inclusion is having a seat at that table, and belonging is having your voice heard at that table. So we want to go beyond accessibility, which is just the bottom line is just being able to get into the building. We want employees and employers to feel like they belong right at the end of the day. And that should be the goal of any organization.
Right, that's going to be a soundbite, Estella. So I'm gonna you're gonna find that on social media in a few days.
I still don't. I will not take credit for that. I just trying to find who said that quote, but it's one that I absolutely love.
No, it's great. Thank you for sharing that. And Sydney, let's go back to you for a second. So how can organizations build a culture of kind of disability inclusion that goes beyond accommodations? I think we've heard a few there from Estella, but is there anything else that you think needs to be highlighted?
Yeah, I think accommodations kind of, again, the starting place, and it's usually human resources or the managers do that, but co-workers play such a pivotal role in actually fostering the disability inclusion in the workplace. And so being able to have those conversations, and even having, for example, Estella just said about the employee resource groups, the ERGs, so many organizations, they have ERG groups around disability, but it's more for parents of kids that have disabilities. So having a threshold of ensuring that people with disabilities are actually, that have that lived experience in the workplace, are actually getting their voices heard and having their experiences told, and also having that allyship from their fellow coworkers that want to understand and better support that in the organization. And really doing kind of like, you can either do formal or informal gathering of information of how people feel about your culture. Do they feel like they can speak up? Do they feel like they can voice their concerns? Do they feel it between their managers? Do they feel it between their co-workers? You know, what are the levels? Where do they feel most comfortable? And it's not direct, it's tied to disability inclusion, but it's so much bigger than that at the same time. But it's really going to help you understand that everyone wants to be included at the end of the day. And that in order to really make sure that we are inclusive and we are creating that sense of belonging, we're seeing how people feel about the culture and actually actively listening to each other and listening to our employees that are like in meetings or, you know, off and on meetings and, you know, via email, via Slack, using the channels to communicate to. And I think there's a misconception that when people speak up, they're like, oh, they're saying we're not doing a good job, but they felt safe enough to come to you to disclose, because actually only 25% of people with disabilities disclose in the organization. And I can guarantee you there's a lot more than that. And so I think a lot of companies are looking at, okay, how do we better hire and recruit people with disabilities? But in the flip side, you should think about, okay, how can we better retain our people and create a safer environment for our people, where they feel like they don't have to sweep things underneath the rug and can actually come to us with their issues, and really help foster that sense of inclusion and belonging, where everyone can thrive and do the work they want to do and be able to do it to the best of their ability.
Yeah, and I think the byproduct of making everything more accessible to multiple different types of people is that actually, you know, you're making the workplace accessible overall. You know, it might be something that's preventing someone who perhaps doesn't have a disability, but might have something else that's preventing them from, you know, being able to access the workplace, that you know, by offering that flexibility is also allowing them to join the workplace. So it kind of has that knock-on effect of, you know, whether your focus is just people with disabilities or not, it broadens the scope out really of who else you can bring into your organization.
For, like I said about accessibility is, you know, getting people in the building, and inclusion is making sure everyone's included in the belonging piece. But really understanding that accessibility means that everyone has the access to the resources they need to be successful, and it's synonymous with people with disabilities. But like, you know, look at all the different technology we have. For example, on our phones, dark mode, that's an accessibility feature. But I know people that don't have disabilities that just prefer that, and it's better for their eyes in the long run, right? And so it helps everyone.
Amazing stuff. And Hayley, a last question for you. What advice would you give to employers who are looking to attract and retain talent who might have disabilities?
So I would say, ask them, don't ever make assumptions about what people need, about what people can do. Always ask them. And then if you've asked, actually listen to what they're saying and try to be understanding about what they're saying, even if you can't necessarily relate to it yourself. And then this is really important, and it might sound obvious, but it's not. Then believe them. Believe that they need this adaptation or this equipment or whatever it is they're asking for. I had a really unpleasant experience years ago where I needed some extra lighting, and everybody that was involved with it, from my line manager to facilities to even my colleagues, everybody made me feel awful about it. And it was just a lamp. And it was just such an upsetting experience. And lost my train of thought. I know I would do this. Yeah, so just believe them. Nobody's asking for adaptations just for the fun of it. You know, we're asking because we need it. And then finally, I would say educate, like you talked about, educate the line managers, but also educate everybody, like at all levels, because if my colleagues at my level have been a bit more understanding about that situation with the lighting, maybe it wouldn't have been so upsetting, but I kind of felt like everybody was against it because nobody understood why I needed this light. And I think if I'd known about access to work then, which I didn't, because it's not very well promoted, I would say, I would have tried to get everybody in on like some accessibility training or some disability awareness training, just to sort of make them think a little bit differently about that whole situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we've kind of already talked about with access to work, it's probably, you know, it's also oversubscribed probably at the moment with waiting lists as they are. But thank you, panelists, for answering those questions. I think there was an awful lot to come out of that. And actually, we're at the end of the scheduled hour, so we've managed to get all of the important stuff in. To our guests, if you would like to ask any questions, please pop them into the Q&A chat or even the webinar chat before we finish, and we will get to your questions if you have any. But I just want to again thank the panelists for taking the time out today to talk to us about disability inclusion, and also thank you again to US Tech Solutions for their participation in making this event happen. For those of you who haven't really learned about the UWI before or don't really know what we do, then please do visit theuwi.com to find out more. And we have more events like this happening, although hopefully we won't have technical issues next time, across the next few months. So please do take a look at those. So I don't know if we have any questions. I'll give it just a second to see if anyone has any questions. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you with us. And for those of you who are here with us, we will be sending this recording out after the event, along with the kind of the highlights of today's conversation. And for those of you who aren't with us, well, you'll know this already, but we'll send you the recording to you so that you haven't missed all this great content. Panelists, if you could just stay on the call just for a few more minutes, I'd just like to do a debrief with you. And thank you everyone else for joining.